We talk a lot about what's at stake in this election: abortion, immigration, the economy. But what if I told you one of the most important issues is a law, a little known law that has just passed in the European Union? And what if I told you that Donald Trump is the only person that can mitigate the great harm this law would cause to people like you, to American business owners? Here to explain this incredible, disturbing story is Justin Haskins. He is the author of many books with Glenn Beck, and he has educated us on the emerging global order that mostly progressives in charge have been pushing through companies like BlackRock, through international institutions, through national governments. And he is here to break it all down for us today with a little bit of hope, because we can make a difference. We can push back on this, but we have to have the courage to do it. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Good Ranchers. Go to goodranchers.com. Use code Allie at checkout. That's goodranchers.com, code Allie. Justin, thanks so much for coming back and seeing us.
Yeah, it's great to be back here and in the studio. It's so cool to be here.
I know. You haven't been to the new studio.
Nope.
Okay, so you're here to bring us your trademark optimism, right?
Yep.
To tell us how awesome the world is and how things are going to be great.
That's why they bring me in.
Yay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Can't wait to hear it.
Nothing could be further from the truth.
Oh, no.
Unfortunately.
I always have to end our episodes with some encouragement for people. But obviously the things that you have to say are important because they're real.
Mm-hmm.
We wouldn't be talking about it if it was just like, these are your crazy projections based on your theories. You're telling us things that are actually going on so that people cannot be paranoid, but can be as prepared and knowledgeable as possible.
Yep.
And you're always covering what is actually going on beyond the headlines. What's going on behind the scenes that no one really wants us to know about. So let's start there. What's going on?
There is so much going on. I think the most important story that has gotten completely drowned out by all the crazy stuff that's been happening in presidential elections and assassination attempts and debate performances and all of that is that there's this new law that was passed in the European Union, which at first most people, when they start to hear Europe, who cares?
Yeah.
It's like the first thing.
Yeah.
But it's going to impact every single American. It's called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the most sexy title you could ever come up with, right? Essentially what it does is create ESG social credit scores for companies, okay? So we've talked about this before, and we've talked about the Great Reset and BlackRock and a lot of those kinds of things. These ESG scores are designed to transform the way companies operate, the kinds of products and services that they can sell, and then by extension, transform societies around it. So lots of climate change initiatives are in there, biodiversity rules, land and water use, all kinds of social justice,
LGBTQ.
Yeah. Oh yeah. How diverse is your board of directors? How diverse is your management team? Like, these are the kinds of things that are in these ESG scores. Well, in the United States, there's no ESG law. There's no social credit scoring law. It's all being imposed by private companies, public-private partnerships between
like
BlackRock, exactly.
So just to clarify, to give people an idea, Target, for example, like one of their majority owners, I think, is BlackRock. Yep. And then they've got Vanguard. And these are these huge global entities that champion progressive values for reasons we could probably talk about. Right. They're probably manifold. But a lot of people ask, okay, why doesn't Target care more when the customers stand up for something? Well, it's because they care more about what BlackRock tells them to do than what the suburban mom tells them to do. But a question I have for you, and I don't want to derail us, but just because I know this will kind of help people understand what's going on, is that sometimes it does seem like companies respond to customers, and it surprises me. For example, last year when it came to Pride Month, a lot of customers raised a big ruckus about what was being sold in these stores. Surprisingly, in response, I guess, to the backlash, this year it was extremely subdued. And even people said, look, I went in June, I didn't see any pride stuff, and I only saw patriotic stuff for 4th of July. So my question to you, with all of this ESG, why do corporations ever respond to what the customers say, especially when they're conservative customers, when, as you've explained, they don't really have a profit incentive to do so?
Yeah. So there's a balancing act that's going on right now. All right. So you have BlackRock and these big asset managers and other big shareholders of these companies that are really interested in moving towards a left-wing society. Okay. But at the same time, they want to make money. So they want to make money too. It's not like BlackRock doesn't want to make money. They do.
Yeah.
And so
even they have more money than I can even
They have,
quantify.
More than $10 trillion under assets under management at one point. So, I mean, huge amounts of money. So what BlackRock is in those kinds of entities are pushing on companies is they want to move as far to the left as they can without losing money. So the more people find out about these things, the more BlackRock backs off a little bit of their pressure on a company like Target because they don't want to lose money either. A lot of these policies have actually been in place to varying degrees for a long, long time, but it was only recently that people started understanding what was going on. And so for a long time, they were moving the ball forward very, very slowly, and most people didn't notice it. I think they just thought, Target is moving to the left because the leadership at Target is kind of leans left and society kind of leans left. And it's all just moving in that direction very slowly. But in reality, there was this ESG stuff going on behind the scenes, and it was all just happening very slowly. Then around 2020 with COVID, everything ramped up huge. There was a real concerted effort to transform society quickly. A lot of that was in the wake of Trump. Trump scared a lot of people in these elite circles who they now, you had 8 years of Barack Obama, and they thought for sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win in 2016. And they thought, okay, this transformation of society can happen kind of slowly, and we're moving in the right direction.
And when you say they,
I mean BlackRock, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, United Nations,
the World Economic
Forum,
Klaus Schwab,
absolutely.
George Soros.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, when people hear those names, they think, that's just conspiratorial. Those people aren't even real. Right. They have real tangible power.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this movement towards ESG has actually slowed a little bit in recent years, at least the front-facing version of it. What they are telling us and what they're doing, the in-your-face kind of stuff, because the backlash was significant when people learned what was going on, and it cost them some money. And once it started costing them some money, BlackRock said, and other similar entities, okay, we need to slow this down a little bit, at least for now, and do more of this stuff behind the scenes. And so actually a lot of corporate policies haven't changed, but the in-your-face stuff, they've backed off a little bit because of how offensive it was to so many people. And so that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to move to the left without making it so offensive that people stop buying the products.
They understand that people can only tolerate so much cultural change, and they're probably afraid if they push too far, then they could start losing people that would otherwise be progressive. I think even Barack Obama realized, I can only push so far so fast before everyone starts to recoil. I also think, and I'm not trying to derail us onto the election, but just an example of that, you'll notice that Kamala Harris and the Democrats have not talked about transgenderism at all. They're not championing trans rights.
Nope.
ABC didn't bring that up at the presidential debate. That wasn't a part of the DNC.
Yep.
That's not a part of any of the ads. They'll use like the old school like rainbow flag, but they won't use the trans flag.
Yep.
They know, even though they are gearing to push it, they have pushed it this administration, they will continue to weaponize the government to, shove this down people's throats. They don't publicly talk about that in an election year because it's too much too fast, even for moderates.
Yeah, that was the biggest mistake that Donald Trump made in the debate, was not bringing it up.
Yeah.
Why didn't he ask her flat out, Kamala Harris, what do you think about biological men participating in girl sports. Like,
Yeah.
what do you think of that? Are
Yeah.
you in favor of that or not? Because she has to say yes,
Of course.
or ignore it.
Yeah.
But she can't go against the, base of
Yeah.
her party and not bringing that up. Yeah, I totally agree. So this law that happened in the European Union, they finally passed it. It took them years to put it together. They passed it in May of this year, 2024. And unlike the ESG policies that we've been talking about so far, which are driven by the private sector, this is being driven by the government. So the European Union is codified these social credit scores for companies, okay? So they came up with their own left-wing ideas and values, and they passed this law in 2024, and they said it applies to large companies that are based in the European Union or non-EU companies, large non-EU companies that do above a certain amount of revenue in the European Union. So, for example, Apple or McDonald's or companies like that, if they surpass this threshold of revenue, which is $489 million, then they have to adhere to these ESG rules as well. What's really important about this is they don't have to adhere to the ESG rules only in the European Union. It has to be everywhere. So it's not enough for McDonald's or for Apple or for Meta or for Microsoft or for Google or and I could name a million other companies that this will apply to. It's not enough for them to change their policies in the EU. They have to change it in America. They have to change it everywhere they do business. That's what the law says. And if they don't, then they can be fined 5% of their total worldwide revenue. So for a company like Apple, if you do the math, that's $19 billion for one violation.
Wow.
So no one's going to violate this law because they can't afford to violate this law. Okay? So it embeds all kinds of crazy left-wing things about climate change, social justice, all the stuff you would imagine would be in there is in there. But what makes it even crazier than that is that one of the requirements for these large companies that are covered under this law is that they have to impose it on all of the, not all, but almost all of the businesses that they work with in their supply chains upstream and downstream, no matter where they're located or how much business those companies do in the EU. So, for example, Ford would be covered under this law. Ford is a car company, sells cars in the EU above the threshold, so they have to adhere to it. They also have to make sure, Ford does, that all the businesses that they do business with in America are also doing these ESG scores. So you could be a rubber manufacturer in Ohio that does no business in Europe, but you make rubber for Ford. You also have to adhere to the EU rule. And Ford is going to be the one that imposes it on you through contractual assurances and other stuff. So if Ford doesn't do that, then Ford gets fined 5% of their total worldwide revenue. So obviously they're going to do this. So when you start playing out the ramifications of this, they're enormous. We're talking about if you're a potato farmer who sells potatoes to McDonald's in Idaho, you now have to adhere to these left-wing ESG rules, even though you don't do any business in the EU at all. If you're a truck driver that just transports products for any of these companies, if you're a farmer that sells food, that sells cabbage to any of these companies, if you just do one little tiny piece of the component, or you do marketing for one of these companies, or you do software services for one of these companies, you will have to adhere to these ESG rules too.
Yeah.
And through this, you can transform the entire country, because you can transform hiring practices, business practices, the kinds of products that people sell and buy, the commitment to social justice goals generally. And none of this comes from an American law. It's all from this EU law.
Quick pause to tell you about our first sponsor for the day. It's Adele Natural Cosmetics. They are a family-run, holistic, handcrafted, toxin-free cosmetic and skincare company. I use their products every day. I love their Blue Lagoon line. It smells so good, and it really makes my skin so moisturized and soft. I started using Adele Natural Cosmetics a few years ago. I really wasn't taking care of my skin. I wasn't paying attention to the ingredients in any of my skincare. And then as I started to age a little bit, I realized, okay, this really matters. And as someone who has drier skin, I wanted products that would leave my skin feeling moisturized without feeling greasy. And that's why I love Adele Natural Cosmetics. It really works, and all the products are completely natural. Plus, this is a company run by a family that loves the Lord. They're unapologetic about their pro-life and Christian values. So it's just a win all around. Go to AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com. Use code Allie for 25% off your first time purchase. AdeleNaturalCosmetics.com, code Allie. What's the end goal? Like what kind, I know we've answered this before, but a lot of people are listening to this kind of conversation for the first time. Like, what is the picture of the world that they think that they are painting through this? Because obviously they think they're doing the righteous thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a couple of factors at play. One of them is financial. So in the European Union, a lot of these things that they're trying to impose are already the law. So when they created this law, the idea was not to make EU companies do these things. EU companies are already forced to do these things in many cases. Europe is much further to the left than the United States in many ways. Not in all ways, but in many ways. What the problem that Europe has is they have to compete with everybody else who doesn't have to do all of this stuff, right? So they have these climate transition plans and laws and all the stuff that we don't have in the United States. They have all these taxes and things that we don't have in the United States. And so the companies that we have here are at a competitive advantage over the companies based in the EU, but not under this. They're essentially saying, if you want to do any business at all in the EU, then you got to make sure that you are adhering to our rules and that everyone you do business with is adhering to our rules. And what that effectively does is make the world comply with all these costly EU regulations.
Yeah.
So they're imposing this crazy amount of costs on all these companies all over the world to make it easier for the EU-based companies to compete with them. So it's kind of like a trade war almost.
Yeah.
It's a really backwards way of doing it, I guess, and a secret way of doing it, but that's a big part of it.
It's kind of like corporate communism because, I mean, it's just like any left-wing proposal. You're pulling everyone down to the lowest common denominator. I mean, that's what equity is. I remember Vice President Kamala Harris, she put out a video when she was running for president last time saying equity means we all end up in the same place, which is actually not truthfully, fundamentally what equity is supposed to mean. It's supposed to mean treating everyone the same way. But she said equity means everyone ending up in the same place, which of course was the vision of Marx and has always been the vision of communists. But these policies never lift everyone up to the highest place that you can be, but rather pulls everyone down to the lowest and poorest place you can be. And that's what it seems like is happening. It's not like they're allowing these EU companies to level up and compete with the American companies. It's saying, no, you're going to be just as poor and just as hamstrung as we are.
That's right. That's exactly right. And on that note, one of the craziest parts of the law, which we just found out about really, is that buried in this massive law, there's like one long paragraph that essentially mandates that these companies participate in one of the largest transfers of wealth ever in history. And the way they do it is through this. One of the big questions that we had for a long time when we were researching this law, and I've been looking at it for 3 years, basically, they've been working on it for 3 years, is, well, how are you going to make China like go woke? And how are you going to make China make sure they have the right number of trans people or blacks or whatever on their board of directors? Like, obviously, they're not going to do that.
Yeah.
What about some poor farmer in Mexico who sells a particular product for some food distributor? I mean, are you really expecting them to adopt like electric powered, farm equipment and stuff? Yeah, of course. Like, they're not going to be able to do that. So what are you going to do? And we thought what they were going to do was simply selectively enforce it, We're
Right.
only going to enforce it on the people we want to change, and then we'll just look the other way when it comes to China and the
Which
people we
is what
can't.
the WEF and the UN does
Yeah.
for human rights issues, all that kind of thing.
Exactly. But we were wrong. There is a long paragraph buried in this law that says if you're one of these major companies and you go to someone in the supply chain and you say, hey, you need to adopt electric powered cars because the EU tells us we can only do business with people who have electric powered cars, so you have to start moving in that direction. And XYZ company in China says, no, we're not going to do that because if we do that, we're going to lose a bunch of money. We can't survive. We can't have the same wage standards that you have. We can't have the same environmental standards. We can't do any of those things. Sorry. Then what the law says is the large company that's forced to impose this on these smaller companies in China or Mexico or wherever has to pay for the transition to happen. So in other words, Ford buys some sort of component from some manufacturer in China. They go to them in China and they say, you got to go to electric, all solar power for your factory. And they say, no, otherwise we'll go under if we do that. Then Ford has to pay for them to go for solar.
So
Ford
but
has
then
to be the
Ford
one that
is
does
like
it.
disincentivized to go to those companies and say, hey, we want you to make these for us. But I guess you're saying that Ford basically, under this law, they have no option
Right.
but to go to a company, and either they find a company that can afford to comply with the law themselves, or they will just have to pay. And so everyone's forced,
That's
right, to pay up in some way.
I mean, what it actually says is that companies are expected to help them make the transition rather than go find another company. So the explicit purpose of this is to make all of these companies all over the world transform in line with the EU objective.
Even like the poor avocado farmer.
That's right.
And
don't worry about it. Whoever, some big massive corporation in America will pay you, poor avocado farmer, to make the transition. But in reality, they're not going to pay for it.
Yeah.
They're just going to pass all those costs along to consumers. That's who's going to end up paying
so
for it.
is there anything that, say President Trump wins in November, is there anything he could do to mitigate the harm caused to American companies?
Well, if he does nothing, we'll start with that. If he or Kamala Harris just do nothing, they don't help it, they don't hurt it, they just do nothing, then it will happen. Because this is all being driven by the EU and big corporations that want to do business in the EU. And for them, financially, it will always make sense to stay in that market rather than leave the market because they're making enough money that it makes sense for them.
Yeah. Wait, sorry. You just say so much and I just have so many questions. Why don't all the corporations, like why doesn't Apple, why don't these big corporations just stand up and say, no, EU, we're not doing this?
Yeah. Well, they make enough money in the EU that it makes sense. It's cheaper for them to pay for the transitions that they have to pay for than it is for them to leave the EU market.
But what if they do they not have enough power to bully the politicians to tell them, no, we're not going to do that?
Apparently not. I mean, they seem to have lost all ability to. There was a huge fight for 3 years. Lobbyists were trying very hard to stop this. Most industries lost, and the EU, sort of the far left wing of the EU, was successful in pushing this thing through.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is there is a giant carve out for one industry. That one industry is the financial industry. They did manage to get a carve out for them. So the rules only apply to them in their own specific business operations. So if you're a big bank, for example, and you buy paper for sending out letters to people, then you got to make sure your paper supplier is, following these rules. But you don't have to worry about where your money goes.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about where you get your money or where you send your money or what kind of loan agreements that you have with people or things like that. Why? Because you would think that's How is that any different than someone who sells radios to Ford or something? They're part of because there was a carve out made for them, and there was a crony deal that was cut out for them, and that was negotiated, and there was lots of fighting and all of that. So the big corporations did try to stop this because they don't want to do it, and they lost.
Second sponsor for the day is Good Ranchers. All right, we are talking about all of these global initiatives to fundamentally change how business owners do business. That also includes farmers and ranchers. They have been hit so hard by these so-called climate change policies and economic policies over the past several years. They need our support. One of the best ways that you can support local farms and ranches is by buying all of your meat from Good Ranchers. All of their better than organic chicken, their craft beef, their steak, all of their seafood. It's all from American farms and ranches, so you can trust that it's really high quality. You know where it's coming from. Subscribe, get your box of meat to your front porch every month. That's what we do. It's saved us so much time and so much money. Right now, they've got this awesome deal where if you subscribe, they will give you a free add-on of meat every month in your box for 4 years. Plus, if you use my code Allie, you can get an additional $25 off your box. Go to ranchers.com, code Allie. Does George Soros have his fingerprints on this? I mean, actually directly, or no?
I don't think so. I think this was driven, George Soros has his fingerprints on everything to some extent, and I'm sure you could find a nonprofit that was pushing for this that also got money from George Soros, but you could do that for almost anything. Generally speaking, this was something that was wanted by the far left. Think of like the AOC types in the EU. They wanted this. They've wanted it for a long time, and they felt like the next stage of transforming society can't happen until they solve this financial problem of the EU companies not being able to compete with competitors around the world. Because it's so easy for an EU company, anytime you want to do something crazy, to say to the EU politicians, if you do this to us, the EU economy is going to collapse. We can't do this. So they came up with a way to say, okay, well, we'll just make everyone do it.
We'll just make everyone
Don't worry
collapse.
about it. Right.
And everything that comes from this faction of the world seems to have a chaotic and deleterious effect on the United States. And I have to think that's part of the issue, is not even just to help EU companies, but to purposely hurt the United States, because a strong U.S. is really against the whole global order and regime that they're trying to create.
Correct.
So back to that, I completely derailed us. The president, if it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, if they do nothing, it's going to happen.
Correct, because it's already the law. Transition is already starting to happen. Big corporations are already being told by law firms, you got to do this. Here's the things you got to do. This is all documented. It's happening. The only way to stop it is to have a president and Congress. President might be able to do some of this on their own because they do have a lot of power in negotiating trade deals and things like that. But you have to, at the very least, have the president. A Congress alone wouldn't be able to do it. Go to the EU and say, no. Like, you can do this to everybody else, but you can't do this to us. And the reason the United States can do that and Mexico can't is because the United States is needed more by the EU than we need the EU. We do a lot of business with the EU, a lot of trade with the EU, but it's mostly for luxury items, things we don't actually need.
I mean, when's the last time you've had anything where it's, made in Spain?
Yeah, exactly. It's mostly high-end products and luxury items and luxury cars and fashion and stuff like that we're getting from them, wine, things like that. We can live without that stuff. Yeah. But they can't live without us. We provide them with cheap energy. We provide them with software. We provide them with emerging technologies. They can't live without Apple, So we have all the leverage. The only reason this is happening is because the people who are in power want it to happen. That's the only reason. Yeah. And so Donald Trump is one of these people who is one of the few politicians, very prominent politicians, Republican or Democrat, who would be completely opposed to something like this. Many,
Yeah.
even Republicans, might be okay with looking the other way
Totally.
while this
Totally.
happens, but not him. And I don't think it's a mistake that they pushed it through right at this moment. They've been trying for 3 years. They weren't able to do it. I think they got nervous about what was going to happen with the election. The transition isn't going to happen without laws, I think.
Yeah.
And they said, we got to get this through before this guy becomes president.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what has occurred.
I want everyone to understand the global mechanism that is invested in Donald Trump not being president. And you don't even have to suggest direct meddling to understand what is at play and all of the huge international powers that are so incredibly financially, ideologically invested in making sure that Kamala Harris or any not Trump candidate is in power. Because someone who flexes America's muscles, which traditionally over the past, at least couple decades has been the Republican. And like you said, there are definitely people on both sides that are complicit. But when it comes to Republican versus Democrat, it's been the Republican side that has been more willing to say, I'll flex our muscles.
Yep.
I'll use our leverage. And Donald Trump is definitely that person. I don't agree with him on everything, but he wants America to be the best.
That's right.
He wants us to take the lead when it comes to trade. He wants the other global powers to know that, hey, we're in charge. I think that most Democrats, most progressives are actually completely invested in America's weakness. Obama was, for sure.
Yeah.
And I have every confidence that Kamala Harris would be.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that Democrats, generally speaking, prioritize the sort of Western global order over America itself.
Oh, totally.
And they've made that very clear in their handling of Ukraine. They've made that very clear in the way that they've dealt with this particular issue that we're talking about today and all sorts of other issues related to the United Nations. They have no problem with paying money out to the entire world without getting anything in return. They have no problem with giving away more and more of America's power to Europe, because they see that as that's the way of having a properly functioning Western world. We all have to be working together, part of the global order and all of that stuff. And so Donald Trump does not fit into that, obviously. He would bristle at, I have no evidence to believe he actually knows about any of this, but he would hate just the concept in general, regardless of what the social credit scores are calling for. They could be right-wing things, but just the idea of having Europe tell us what we should do and how we should live and what our products and services should look like. There's just no way he would be in favor of that. So I think the only way this stops before it goes fully into effect, so it's already been passed into law, it's going to be phased in over several years. More and more companies, they have different thresholds and levels where they get phased in. The only way this stops is if Donald Trump is president of the United States. That's it. And even then, it requires him to do something.
To do something. To what? Basically say we're not complying?
Go to the EU and say, if you want to get our oil and gas, if you want to get our weapons for your wars, if you want to be protected in NATO and all of this other stuff, you're not going to do this to us. You're going to make an exception. You're going to put it into law, and then we can talk. And they will have no choice but to comply.
Yeah.
There's just no choice.
And that would be good, not just for America, but it would be good for all of the people that you described, the poor Mexican farmer, because a strong America is good for the world, whereas the progressive mentality is that a strong America is bad and oppressive for the world. And that's really where the difference in policy comes from. Scary stuff that we are talking about. I think it is an understatement to say that we do not know what the future holds. And gosh, all of these laws, these policies that we're talking about could really affect the supply chain, which affects our ability to get the medicine that we need. Sometimes life-saving medicine, when you're talking about infections and antibiotics, if for whatever reason things hit the fan and you can't go through the traditional means to get a prescription for an infection, you want to make sure that you have an emergency stash of the most common antibiotics, as well as some add-ons like an EpiPen or ivermectin or Tamiflu, and you can get that through Jace Medical. You can also get a Jace Daily Kit, which is a year-long supply of the prescriptions that you and your family rely on a daily basis. Go ahead and take care of this now. It's so much better to be safe than sorry when it comes to the medication that you and your family need. Go to jace.com/Allie. Use code Allie for a discount on your order. That's jace.com, code Allie. All right, let's talk about UN Summit. It's coming up. The Summit for the Future. Right. It sounds cheery, is it?
Well, it depends on your perspective on the world, I guess, right? Yeah. This is another incredible story. This has been going on. This is another one of these multi-year things that have been happening. So going back to the time of COVID into 2021, when we still had lockdowns and COVID insanity, and it was especially bad in Europe well into 2021, the UN Secretary General, that's the head of the United Nations, produced this report called Our Common Agenda. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about it actually before in some of our other interviews. And it was full of just crazy stuff. And the idea was to dramatically expand the power of the United Nations. And they used COVID as their justification for why we would need to do this. It's proof. We have to do something to address future crises. We can't just rely on countries to do the right thing. So Our Common Agenda was this huge proposal put forward, and over the last few years, that has been written into specific proposals, all leading up to this big United Nations summit that's coming up in September at the end of the month, called Summit of the Future, okay? Summit of the Future has 3 international agreements. So think about, a lot of people who are listening to this probably have heard of the Paris Climate Agreement, things like that. Similar kind of thing. Big international agreement. All member states of the United Nations are expected to sign it and to adhere to it. There are 3 international agreements that are going to be brought forward at this big meeting that they've been working on for years. One is called Pact for the Future. And Pact for the Future is probably, at least in the short term, the most problematic one. There are a lot of crazy things that are in it. The most important thing is something called, it's been called a couple different things, but emergency platform is the most dangerous thing that's in it. The emergency platform emerged out of that Our Common Agenda proposal. Essentially what the Secretary General wanted, and it looks like they're going to try to give it to him, is the ability to declare unilaterally a global emergency in the future. And it doesn't really explain what a global emergency is. He gets to decide that in consultation with his experts and stakeholders, they say. And then he gets to have these crazy powers to address this global emergency wherever it is, and to issue penalties to people who are not adhering to the plan that he wants.
Individuals, private citizens?
Well, I think it's countries probably, or governments, but who knows? It's pretty vague, the wording of it. And that he would be able to, these emergencies that he would get to declare would be for a finite period of time, say 90 days or something like that, but that he would have the unilateral authority.
15 days to slow the spread?
Right, yeah. We've heard this before.
We've heard that.
But he has the, similar to that, he has the authority to unilaterally renew this period of time over and over and over again forever.
I could never have predicted that.
Right. So it doesn't matter that it's for a finite period of time if you get to renew it, obviously. So this emergency platform is in this Pact for the Future that the United States, as far as we could tell, based on statements made from the UN ambassadors, American ambassadors to the UN, is going to sign this, is going to agree to it. There are other crazy things in it too. It's not just that. there's a promise to create universal access to abortion without any description, any limitations, as far as I can tell, as to what that means.
I don't understand. I'm not understanding how they have the power to do this. Like if Texas, for example, or Arkansas or Florida, they have a heartbeat bill protecting babies. Like how can the UN come in and say, nope, you can't do that?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, the UN could issue some sort of penalty or something on its own, but how could they actually get the United States to enforce it on Texas or something like that? They probably couldn't. The idea,
unless they had someone to comply.
right?
And we've already seen the weaponization of the DOJ under Biden. And Kamala, not that she needs like a pretext for doing something like that, but she could say, "Oh, this is from the UN. Sorry,
Right.
like we're going to send our Department of Justice and the full force of the intelligence community to your state and the
Yeah,
military,
exactly.
and you're going to comply with
Exactly.
us." And if we don't think that she would do that, then you should take a look at Kamala Harris's record.
Right. Well, and you would never even propose anything if you're the United Nations to go to the final stages of being offered up to member states without making sure that the United States is going to agree to it in the first place. Because if the United States says no, it's dead anyway. And so the United States has so much power. They have the most power in the United Nations by far. They have unilateral veto authority on a whole bunch of different things. They give the most money to the United Nations. Nobody does anything at the United Nations without asking America first. Sometimes they do it knowing the United States is going to say no anyway, and they just want to do it. But in this case, they did it because the United States agreed to these terms. So the leadership of the United States wants this to happen. They're okay with it. And this just gives the federal government more authority to enact these kinds of things. It's easier to go out there and say, look, we've signed this international agreement saying we're going to do this. Like, we have to adhere to our international agreements. What about, norms and the global order and all this stuff that they're always talking about? We have to keep our promises. That was the same kind of stuff they did with the Paris Climate Agreement. And that's exactly what they're going to do here with this. So the emergency platform, universal access to abortion, all kinds of crazy statements about fixing inequalities and structural inequalities between classes and groups.
It says eliminate in their segment on declaration on future generations. It's almost like declaration on future generations. There's such like a new age mystical part of all of this too. It's almost like an incantation that they're conjuring up. Eliminate all forms of persistent historical and structural inequalities. These people need to read a Thomas Sowell book. You cannot eliminate inequality outside of a police state.
Yep.
You cannot.
Right.
If two siblings from the same family who were raised the same way, with the same resources, with the same parents, end up in two different places, sometimes two very disparate places, then of course, two individuals from different countries with different backgrounds, with different innate capabilities are going to end up in different places. Inequality is a fact of life. That doesn't mean injustice, actual injustice, should persist, but inequality, even in the most just societies, will always be there. The elimination of inequality will always mean communism in some form or collectivism in some form.
Yeah, it has to. And I would argue that inequality is actually the sign of a moral society.
Yeah.
Because we don't all deserve the same things.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that's what merit means. Some people deserve more than other people. Now, some people have inequalities that are unjust. You know, that has happened, obviously, and we shouldn't have that. That's why we want equal treatment under the law.
Yeah, there's inequality of outcome, which, as you said, is a sign of a just and fair society. And then there's inequality of process, which we do count as injustice. We believe that everyone should be seen the same under the eyes of the law. Everyone has an entitlement to due process. Everyone is entitled to the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's part of why we believe that human beings inside the womb are entitled to those rights too, because we all have equal worth and deserve equal justice in that sense. But the left, they say that justice means equal outcomes. And that's just not true. That's not true biblically. It's not true historically. It's not even true logically.
It's not possible. either without killing a bunch of people and ending up with communist societies.
Hello.
Right.
Mao.
Yep.
Pol Pot. Like,
Yep.
we've seen it over and over again.
That's exactly right. You wherever they've actually tried to take this to its logical end, you end up with tens of millions of people dead. That's what always happens. And that's in this agreement. So the Declaration on Future Generations, as you pointed out, that's a separate agreement out of the three. The third one is Global Digital Compact. Okay, so the Global Digital Compact is something that was also part of Our Common Agenda. It's focused mainly on regulating technology, especially on the internet. Artificial intelligence is a big part of it. We want to make sure that there's a global governance of artificial intelligence. We want to make sure that AI is being designed fairly and equitably and with social justice in mind and all of that stuff. And obviously, AI can be really bad and dangerous, and there are a lot of problems with it. I just don't trust the United Nations to be the ones that's regulating it.
Right.
In addition to that, there's a bunch of policies in there about dealing with misinformation and disinformation on social media, on the internet generally. How are they going to combat this? We need to create standards that everyone has to adhere to across countries, with the idea in mind that, you can't have Elon Musk running around allowing people to say whatever they want.
Oh, I bet they hate Elon Musk.
Oh, they do hate Elon Musk. Many of these, in fact, the European Union just recently threatened Elon Musk and told him that if he didn't start regulating speech on his platform in a more expansive way, that there were going to be penalties issued to him. They might ban it in the European Union. There were some columnists that were calling for him to be jailed as a result of this. So there's no question about it. That's the goal. And some of the stuff that they talk about relating misinformation is just so incredible. For example, one of the things they want to do is they want to strengthen independent and public media and supporting journalists and media workers through the United Nations. So UN-funded journalists, media outlets, media workers at other outlets. Obviously, this is just propaganda is what they're talking about here. Another quote from it is, provide, promote, and facilitate access to and dissemination of independent, fact-based, timely, targeted, clear, accessible, multilingual, and science-based information to counter mis- and disinformation. So now we're talking about creating a fact-checking organization at the United Nations. Again, these are the same people who during COVID, WHO completely mishandled it, trafficked in misinformation, helped China or allowed China to cover up what was going on with COVID. Then another one, calling on digital technology companies and developers to continue to develop solutions and publicly communicate actions to counter potential harms, including hate speech and discrimination from AI-enabled content that's designed. So again, let's make sure that AI is being designed so that it's not being used for hate speech and misinformation and disinformation. And all of that, of course, is code words for whatever they want it to be, right? I mean, their concept of hate speech is like the show. They just don't want anything that disagrees with their points of view.
Totally.
So let's make sure there's a global governance body to regulate speech, misinformation, disinformation, what you say on social media companies, what AI can be used for, etc. And we'll have a much better world. And this is especially important with AI because AI isn't just used on the internet generally. It's being embedded in all of these different companies like banks and corporations, insurance companies, etc. They use AI all the time. Well, if AI is designed with these woke ideas built into it, and then a bank uses AI, then what does that mean for people's access to loans and that kind of thing? So this is all very, very bad, and we should be fighting against it. And instead, most people aren't even talking about it.
Right.
Never mind fighting against it. And the United States is about to sign us all up for it, saying, yeah, we're 100% behind this.
What do you mean that we're about to sign up for it?
Well, the United States will formally sign this agreement when it comes up in a couple of weeks.
Okay. And
that's
because
what we're being told.
Because it's being run by Joe Biden and Joe Biden is ideologically aligned, or he just doesn't, it's probably not really doing anything.
Yeah. Well, what we've been looking at is statements from the Biden administration's ambassadors to the United Nations saying they like a lot of the stuff that's in this and they're good with it, and they haven't really been drafting it so much, but they seem to be they're totally fine with it.
It's just so funny as we're talking about all of this and all the huge global apparatus that progressives have to force their ideas on the world. And yet we hear that the biggest threat is Christian conservative, Christian nationalism, I'm like, every single global and national institution is completely dominated by progressivism. And like, we're accused of just wanting power and Handmaid's Tale and empire and Christo-fascism and all this stuff. And I'm like, what institutional power do conservative Christians even have anywhere? Are we the ones that are literally using the power of the state to try to rob you of any wealth you have built until you comply with what we believe in? Like, truly, the left is building this global theocracy, like if you even want to, their God, which I think is like the God of self, and they are forcing you to bow down to their idols. And they have the audacity to project that onto like the Christian conservative mom who's just like, I don't like abortion. Oh, you're a fascist.
They have to, because there has to be there has to be someone to blame when things don't go the way that they should be going. When I first started out in public policy, my very first job was working for the Rhode Island Republican Party.
Oh, yeah.
Which is about the most pointless group of people that you could ever imagine.
Aww,
they mean
poor
well.
Rhode Island Republicans. They're probably listening to this.
They mean well. Maybe someone is. I don't know. They mean well. But the craziest part was the Republicans in the media, the Republicans, state, local media, the Democrat Party, they were constantly blaming Republicans anytime anything went wrong. They stopped us. They did this. They did that. When I was there, the state house there had about 100 or so seats in it. 4 of them were Republicans.
Wow.
The rest were Democrats. And maybe a handful of independents or something. They had no power, but they were still blamed on a daily basis anytime anything went wrong.
Yeah.
And so you have to do that. That is the sign of an authoritarian regime. You must have a scapegoat. And every authoritarian regime that has ever existed has taken a tiny minority of society and said, whether it's the Jews in fascist Germany under the Nazis, or in China, where they had all kinds of different minority groups, including a lot of educated people and the Cultural Revolution and stuff that they had there, or Cambodia, where you had disabled people and things like that they were mass murdering. There's always some group of people who you have to blame and say, well, if we just didn't have to take care of all these disabled people, or if the Jews just weren't the ones running the world, or whatever the conspiracy theory of the day is for them that helps them, you have to have it. Otherwise, if things aren't going well, it's on you. You're the one in charge. And so you must have this. And that's no different today than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago.
All right, last sponsor for the day is NetSuite. All right, you heard all of that, business owners. Things are looking a little precarious. And so you want to go ahead and make sure all of your systems, your processes are in one place, and that you are using the most efficient methods possible to track your business's performance, your KPIs, and that's why you need NetSuite, the #1 cloud ERP that brings accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. Over 38,000 businesses have future-proofed their business with NetSuite by Oracle. With one unified business management suite, you've got one source of truth that gives you visibility and control you need to make quick and good decisions. Go to netsuite.com/Allie to get the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/Allie. So is there anything that we can do in addition to voting against Kamala Harris in November? Is there anything the average American that's listening to this can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think earlier we talked about it a little bit. Why is it that Target is not as woke this year as they were like 3 years ago? There's a reason for that. It's because the more people learn about these things, so much of this stuff is being done in darkness. and people don't realize what's happening. And then they go to the store and they just see these things and it doesn't make sense to them. They don't understand why it's occurring. The more that people know, it really does matter. The more they push back against it, the more that they complain. People underestimate that. A lot of people think, I'm just one person, so what can I do? What does it really matter? I'm not in media or what. I don't have a podcast. What am I going to do? These companies really do care when they get even a small amount of letters or emails complaining about things because they're not used to getting any. So just a small number of things really does make a huge difference, because in their minds, if they're getting 20 angry emails one day and they normally get one, that's like, oh my God, there's a crisis. Something's really bad here. They see that as a sign of a much larger pushback. And so people can take the initiative and at least slow things down. They can't totally stop it without voting for the right people, but they can at least make these companies think twice before they go all in on this stuff.
Yeah. And hopefully there is, generational change. We would have thought that we could have never overcome the abortion lobby in the United States to get to a point where we're overturning Roe v. Wade. I mean, for 49 years, people thought that that's impossible. And then all of a sudden it happened because of some legislators in Mississippi that listened to their voters and decided to pass a law that eventually made its way to the Supreme Court that was filled with nominees by presidents who were voted for by pro-life Americans since the 1990s or even 1980s. I don't remember when Clarence Thomas took his seat, but all of that matters, and it matters over time. And as you said, I think the most encouraging part of this, but also just like it shows what a precarious position that we're in, is the muscle that America still has and how other countries do defer to us, even if they talk a big game about not liking America and all of that stuff. At the end of the day, America has a lot of power. I want to vote for someone that's willing to flex our muscles on behalf of not just our citizens, but all the people that are affected by this kind of just like anarcho poverty tyranny. I don't even know. It's like it's so hard to even describe exactly what it is. But
what I love to tell people is, if you were living in like the late 1940s and you were a limited government conservative American, I think a lot of people today, they think back to that time and they think, well, America was much more conservative then. And in a lot of ways it was. But if you were living in that time, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the most socialistic, progressive presidents that in history, had just been elected for the fourth time in a row.
Yeah.
And you had just lived through 2 world wars where millions of people were dying all around you, friends, family members. You still have inadequate health care. You have people, massive amounts of poverty and underdevelopment and all of that stuff. The Constitution was just being railroaded at every turn. When Franklin Roosevelt didn't get what he wanted, he threatened to pack the Supreme Court, and they elected him anyway multiple times. You had all kinds of problems with segregation and all of this stuff. You still had China out there in the world doing horrible things with Mao and all of that in the going into the 50s and that sort of thing. If you were living in the 40s and the 50s and you were looking at the rise of the Soviet Union, development of nuclear weapons, the Cold War, all of that.
And then the 60s and 70s were kind of crazy too.
Yeah, you wouldn't have thought, I think things are going to turn out pretty well. You just wouldn't have thought that. And it took a long time. Republicans did not run Congress for like 40 or 50 years in a row. People don't realize that.
Yeah.
That's why in the 1990s, they talk about Newt Gingrich and the Contract for America and all that. That's because Republicans had won in 50 years. So if you were living in that moment in time, you would think things are very dark and they're getting worse.
Yeah.
But eventually they turned around because people kept fighting.
Yeah.
And that is the key. You have to keep fighting. And it's okay to think maybe in the next 10 years, things are not going to be spectacular.
Yeah.
The left, for a long time, was not the favored majority in society.
Yeah.
And they had to imagine what they wanted the world to look like 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And we have to start thinking like that too. It's okay to think that way. It can be depressing, I get it, but that's how you change society.
Yeah.
Long-term views, you continue to fight, you never give up, and you have faith that in the end, the good will win out over the evil.
Yeah. And bringing it to the light like you do is so important. Gosh, as you were talking, I was thinking, and Ronald Reagan didn't get everything right, but without Ronald Reagan, the world would look very, very different than
Yes,
it
it would.
does today. The Republican Party would look different. He really reinvigorated not only the GOP, but really the United States and Western civilization through his peace through strength policies. And yeah, that is something to look at and to think about, and for us to vote to try to reenact here. Thank
Yep.
you so much for what you do, just bringing the darkness into light. As you said, that's where they thrive, like mold. And so we got to expose it. Thank you so much. I really
Thanks,
appreciate
Allie.
it. Where can people follow you and buy your books? Because you've got a new book coming out with
Yeah.
Glenn soon.
Yep. They can follow me on social media at Justin T. Haskins, or go to heartland.org. They can see what we're doing at the Heartland Institute where I work. Glenn and I have a new book coming out October 22nd. So if you're interested, please pre-order. It's called Propaganda Wars. And the idea behind the book is not only to shine light on where propaganda is coming from. Where are these large propaganda campaigns at the World Economic Forum and these other institutions? Who are these people who are promoting this? Why are they promoting it? How do they do it? Why are they so successful? Really shining a light on all of that, especially with the election in mind and the threats that might come about in this election and in future elections. There's a ton of great stuff in there about that. But we also want to give people the tools they need to figure out what is true and what isn't true. So there's a step-by-step guide in there that allows you to actually run news stories through this, follow these steps, and it will help you figure out, okay, is this propaganda or is this something that I can actually trust? And right in time for the election, probably the biggest propaganda event in history, which might be the case. I mean, God knows this last presidential debate that we just had was full of propaganda and just outright lies. If the election is really close, we know that there might be some kind of election crisis. There's talk of deep fake election crises and things like that. So
gosh.
this book is preparing you for that reality. So people can
Scary.
pre-order it. Propaganda Wars, Glenn Beck and Justin Haskins on Amazon.com and wherever you get your books.
Thanks so much, Justin.
Thanks, Allie.